before I forget. Yeah, so just a couple little housekeeping notes as well. We talked about cameras, but if you keep your microphones muted just so that we avoid any background noise, answering questions at the end. And then also when we're asking questions too, just being mindful of confidentiality. So not mentioning any kids by names or talking about other people's kids. So if you want to ask a question about a specific scenario, just kind of making sure that it's vague enough that nobody would know who you were talking about specifically. I do want to acknowledge that my work usually takes place on the traditional unceded territory of the Kamloops Taste people. I love living in Kamloops and just waking up to the beautiful landscape outside my window every morning. And it always makes me feel very grateful to be a guest in this place and to really honor and acknowledge the people who have taken care of this beautiful place since the beginning. I'm actually, though, today presenting to you from the traditional territory of the Waccamaw Sioux in the eastern US, and I'm also quite happy to be a guest in this beautiful part of the world. So just a quick overview of our objectives today. We're going to talk a bit about trauma and its effects, especially on kids and throughout the life course. And then we're going to talk about some of those protective factors, so how we can mitigate some of the risks that can be associated with childhood traumas. And then at the end, we're going to go through a bunch of hopefully helpful community resources, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. I wanted to just give a quick overview of KSACC. So this is the organization that I work for, the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center. We've been in the community for almost 40 years, and we support individuals who've experienced sexualized violence. And when we say sexualized violence, we really mean any form of violence that is based on a person's gender or their gender expression or gender identity and is intended to control, humiliate, or harm that person. And so basically this includes things like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, any kinds of abuse, stalking, harassment, and those sorts of things. And so we provide counseling and support services, crisis response, legal advocacy, and education and prevention work. So the services listed here are just the things that we offer generally. So our community-based victim services help people navigate the legal system. And then Stopping the Violence, the Sexual Abuse Intervention Program, and the Peace Program are different counseling programs for different ages, so adults and kids. And then our crisis response is our anti-violence hotline. We also do hospital accompaniment for people who have experienced either intimate partner violence or sexual violence. We can sit with them at the hospital if they're seeking medical care. And then we also do community partnerships, education, and outreach. So stuff like we're doing today, and that's the program that I work in. And so I wanted to share our crisis line. I know that, of course, when we're talking about things like trauma, these are things that lots of us have experienced. And so it's really not uncommon when going through a presentation like this, we're not going to be talking about anything in sort of like alarming detail, but that doesn't mean that it might not still trigger something for you that you didn't expect. So if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, or if things are coming up for you and you're just not sure how to deal with it, you can always call our hotline if it's something that you want to talk about that happened at any time in your life, or even if you're wondering how to support maybe someone in your family who you know has experienced sexualized violence or family violence. This hotline is available 24/7, and it's local trained volunteers who are answering that. So just know that that's a resource that is available to you. And also just generally to like know that it's totally normal if something comes up for you during this presentation or after, and just to take care of yourself, whether that's kind of taking some time out this afternoon, you know, drinking a little extra water, just taking things a little bit slower. So I wanted to just ground us first with some definitions about what is trauma. And so I like this definition from Tara Brock, where she says, trauma is when we've encountered an out of control, frightening experience that's disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love. Because it kind of gets to that idea that a trauma is any experience that really just overwhelms our ability to react to it or to feel connected and centered while it's happening. We also know that trauma occurs in response to an actual or a perceived threat to self or others. And so what that means is that a traumatic experience can be something that actually happens, like illness, death, accidents, things like that, or it can be a close call where you thought that something was going to happen and maybe it didn't, but you still had that same overwhelm experience. And so usually these experiences also result in a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so I think probably most of us are pretty familiar with those terms, but it means that there's sort of an unconscious nervous system reaction that happens where you might go into a mode where you're fighting back or maybe running away, or you might just shut down completely. And the thing with these responses too is A, that they're quite out of a person's control, but B, they can often add to that feeling of overwhelm, especially fleeing or freezing, because people might sometimes look back on an experience and think, why didn't I do something? Why didn't I fight back? But in reality, you have no control over that, but it can really contribute to that feeling of helplessness. And then also understanding that trauma is not the event itself, but the effect that the event has on the nervous system. And so this means that two people could experience the same event, and one might experience it as a trauma and the other might not. And that's going to have a whole host of reasons why that might be the case, including your past experiences, your resilience, your community of support, and all kinds of different things. So it's just really to say that there's no comparing people when it comes to traumas, and there's no judgment on whether or not a person finds a particular situation traumatizing. So I wanted to just go through some causes of trauma that could happen in childhood. And there are many others outside of these, but just to sort of give an example of the range of things that can cause trauma in childhood. So of course, any kind of abuse, separation from loved ones, even at a really early age, neglect, bullying can cause trauma, especially if it's ongoing and the child doesn't have a good support network. Some of the effects of poverty, so that could be including like family stress or even just the physical aspects of not having enough to eat or not having proper housing, witnessing violence, unmanaged parental mental health struggles. So if there's a lot of early erratic behavior in the home, parental substance misuse, which is sort of related, there can be a lot of volatility sometimes. Racism and other forms of systemic oppression can be traumatic for kids. Any kind of accidents like car accidents or anything else that sort of causes like a physical trauma can also cause a mental and emotional trauma. Homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia can cause a lot of trauma for queer youth, especially if it is coming from within their family home. But even just the sort of systemic level oppressions that QS and LGBTQ plus kids face. And then things like natural disasters can also be traumatizing when they're experienced by anyone. I wanted to just show a short video too about understanding childhood trauma and some of the ways that it affects the brain. And so the thing with this video is she's going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of neuroscience side of things, which is not so important to really understand all of that, but just to sort of see it as a big picture overview of all the different ways that trauma is affecting kids. And also I really like in this video that she talks a lot about how that trauma response can often manifest as behaviors that look like sort of bad behaviors in kids, and how really those behaviors are coping mechanisms that kids have come up with to keep themselves safe. And so how we can respond to that in a way that's helpful rather than harmful. So I'm just gonna switch to the other screen so that we can see this.
Is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Back to this. So yeah, I really like that she talks about in that video how we can approach thinking about kids who've experienced trauma and some of the behaviors that they display. And also a lot of what she talked about with the connection and social networks and things like that are things we're going to talk about when we get into talking about protective factors. And so, I'm sorry, hang on just one moment. So then when we're thinking about some of the effects of trauma, there can be a whole bunch of different ways that this can show up in people's behavior. And so there can be physical reactions to trauma, so disproportionate reactions to stress. So kids might get really overwhelmed by things that don't seem like they should be or would necessarily cause a lot of stress in someone else. Kids might have issues with chronic headaches or stomach aches, sleep issues, and even bedwetting sometimes, like at an age where you wouldn't expect to see that behavior. And even an inability to put trauma into words. And this can happen because, again, of some of the neuroscience behind it, where there are certain aspects or areas of the brain that are affected by trauma that also are where language happens. And so sometimes it's really hard for people to articulate the trauma that they've experienced. And then sometimes for that reason, it gets brushed off, or people think it can't be that bad if it, if you can't really articulate what it was. So understanding that sometimes kids won't even be able to tell you about some of the traumas that they experienced or what it meant to them to have some of the experiences that they've had. Then intellectually, you can see things like difficulties thinking and learning. And so they might be struggling in school, impaired memory, difficulty switching tasks. So kids sometimes will get really focused on one thing and then trying to get them to, put away what they're doing and come to dinner, or focus on something else can cause a big explosion of emotions that seems disproportionate to what you're asking them to do. And then dissociation and daydreaming, again, this can really impact how kids do at school. If it just looks like they're not paying attention, sometimes, again, that's a bit of a coping mechanism that people develop because of trauma they've experienced. Emotionally, you can see things like low self-esteem, feeling unsafe, having a hard time regulating emotions, and then a lot of distrust. And unfortunately, sometimes that can be even for caregivers and other people in their life who really do have their best intentions. But for kids who've been through a lot, trust can be really hard. And then depression and anxiety, whether or not it's diagnosed. Behaviorally, again, kind of talked about this a bit in the video, but some of those more like aggressive behaviors and also look like fighting and running away, lack of impulse control, substance use, and risk taking. So kind of a lot of behaviors that can look and feel like really sort of difficult and problematic behaviors as a parent, but understanding that sometimes there is an underlying reason that kids are behaving that way, which doesn't always make it easier to deal with, but can hopefully at least put it a little bit in perspective. And then some of you might have heard of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. Basically, sort of starting in the 80s and 90s, researchers started looking at the effect of having these kinds of experiences in childhood and how that plays out through a person's life. And so they sort of group these adverse childhood experiences into three main categories, which are household challenges, abuse, and neglect. So again, that slide where we looked at some of the causes of trauma for kids, those could all sort of be plugged into those three categories. And what they found was that by giving a bunch of people a questionnaire to see what sort of childhood experiences they had had, and then following up with them years later, they found all of these different effects on a person's life. So a lot of them were things that you might expect, like 4.5% or 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, increased risk of suicide and drug use, but also issues like lung disease, liver disease, which of course might be also related to substance misuse as a coping mechanism for dealing with trauma. And then we see it's really common, like 67% of the population has at least one ACE, But the more you have, the more likely you are to experience some of these things later on in life. But the good thing about the fact that they started doing this research is that then they also looked at, so what about the people who have a lot of ACEs in their history, but are not experiencing these unhealthy outcomes like later in life, the people who have had ACEs but are doing well as they go through their life. And so research has now identified 6 protective factors against these outcomes. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those and how we can actually apply those to help mitigate some of the risks that kids might face later in life because of their adverse childhood experiences. So the first one is nurturing and attachment. Second is knowledge of parenting. The third is parental resilience, social connections for both parents and kids, concrete support for families, and then social and emotional competence. And again, that would be both for kids and for parents. So we're going to go through each one of these. There's also some worksheets that hopefully some of you got or will be able to get access to through SCFS. And it's basically some of the self-reflection questions and things like that. We just put them all onto worksheets for you. We're going to just sort of bring them up as self-reflection. Well, we're not going to go through them. These are kind of things that you might want to spend a little bit of time sitting with and thinking about, but I wanted you to have a place where you could write them down and sort of spend some time thinking about what would it look like to really apply some of these protective factors in your family and in your life. And what kind of implications might that have for you if you're a person who has had your own experiences of ACEs, and how might you be able to begin working through those, how that can help yourself and also the kids in your life. Because the thing about these protective factors is the earlier we can equip kids with these, the better, but it's never too late to start turning things around in terms of negative outcomes. So the first one is nurturing and attachment. And so with attachment, we know that kids who have good attachment with a caregiver early on develop a secure attachment style, which means that they are well connected with their caregiver. They also have sort of a better sense of their own like self-esteem and self-worth. And so fostering that attachment, especially if they didn't maybe have it at some points when they were younger, it's always good to start sooner than later. But there are a lot of things that can get in the way of forming attachment with kids or of being nurturing. And so some of those might be life circumstances like stress or work or being busy and just not having the time. But sometimes it can be our own trauma being triggered by behaviors that we see in our kids that remind us of, even things in ourselves. And so spending some time thinking about what gets in the way of nurturing, and then how might you take care of yourself on those days when nurturing does feel difficult. Sometimes there just might not be a lot of time. That might be, there's too many things to do and you don't feel like you have the time for it, or maybe you're just overwhelmed. And so having some self-care strategies, and again, all of these factors kind of are related to each other, because when we talk about resilience, we'll get into a little bit about some of those strategies that you might employ so that maybe it feels a little bit less overwhelming to try to foster that connection. And then thinking about how can you show love to your kid or kids every day. And when we think about that, it's important to think about like what sort of comes naturally to you. What are the ways that you show love and affection in your family that feel like appropriate ways for you, that come easily to you, maybe that your kid responds to well, because different kids are going to respond to different things. So telling your kid I love you is great, but it can also look like so many other things. It can be doing things together, cooking with them, playing together, doing arts and crafts, even just praising them and acknowledging when they've done something that you're really proud of them for, or something that they feel really proud of themselves about. Laughing together, talking about feelings, attending events together, getting interested in the things that they're interested in, even if you don't really understand like what's so interesting about Minecraft or something else that they really like. Just spending the time to listen to them talk about it and just sort of show a bit of an interest can be a way that they can see that what they're doing matters to somebody, which can really go a long way. And so kind of thinking about ways that you can do that every day, even just something little. So then the second protective factor is knowledge of parenting. And so kind of understanding different developmental stages of kids for one thing, so that you sort of know if kids are hitting those milestones as you would expect them to developmentally. But it also can help with feelings of frustration if you know that, you want your kid to start having empathy and sharing with other kids, but it might just be that they don't have the capacity sort of developmentally at this point in their life to do that. And so if you sometimes can understand that that's the stage that they're going to come into, then that can help with feelings of frustration. So for self-reflection, thinking about like, where do you turn to for child development education or parenting education generally? Because I mean, I think parenting is a really tough thing, and a lot of people just do it without necessarily anyone telling them how to do it well, or feeling like they know what they're doing. And then part of that too is thinking about how we're cared for as a child and how does that influence your parenting? Because there might be things that you feel when you were a kid, someone who cared for you did really well, and you think like, that's something that I want to give to my child. Or it might just be that there were things that people who cared for you, you didn't like the way that they parented. And so you think, okay, I'm going to intentionally do it differently. But the idea is just generally to be a bit more intentional with the strategies that you do use in your parenting, and thinking about how that might reflect your own values, and also be things that really you think helped you out as a kid, or like I said, kind of things that didn't work well for you that you want to do differently. And then thinking about, like she talked about in that video, how understanding child development and trauma can sort of reframe the way we think about challenging behaviors. Like if we can think about those as coping strategies, then maybe we can respond to them differently, even though they still might be just as frustrating when you're dealing with them as a parent. And so then in terms of resources, I just wanted to point to 3 websites that I think are really good and really like research-based parenting education. And these again are all in the worksheets. And so this one, the positive parenting from the CDC, is really great because it breaks down like ages 0 to 17 in about like 2 to 3 year chunks of sort of developmental stages. And it'll talk about like the milestones of that age, and then sort of positive parenting tips for that age of kids, health and safety things to think about at different ages. So it's really quite holistic in terms of all the things it talks about. The Encyclopedia on Early Childhood Development is also great. It's got a behaviors section that just lists like a ton of different behaviors. So if it's things that your kids are experiencing, you can just go to that page and read about it, and then it'll link you to a bunch more resources that are all like good research-based supports and resources. And then the Parenting Resources and Support from the Canadian government has a bunch of different stuff, again, about sort of development and health and safety stuff for kids. So those are 3 really great resources. You might have others that you already use, or kind of perusing through some of these might give you some good ideas, especially if there are behaviors or certain things that you're struggling with. So then the third factor is parental resilience. And we're going to watch just a very short video about what resilience is and how to cultivate a bit more of it. But I wanted to, again, with these self-reflection questions, just kind of get you thinking about like, what does it mean to you to be resilient? Either when you think about other people showing resiliency, or what does resilience mean in your own life, and how and where do you show resilience to yourself and in relation to your situation or your circumstances? And how do you think that resilience influences the way you parent or caregive? And then thinking about how to foster resilience, what forms of self-care or community care do you engage in or access? And self-care and resilience really go hand in hand, because the whole idea with resilience is that it's your ability to respond to stress or other sort of overwhelming situations. And so it's that whole idea of like filling your cup before you can give to anybody else. And sometimes you can do that through forms of self-care, and sometimes you really need other outside supports. And so we're going to talk about that a bunch too, because concrete supports was one of the protective factors. And so we're going to look at a bunch of different community resources, but thinking about ways that you can either have practices for yourself. Like, I think it's a really good idea to even just have one or two easy breathing techniques that you use when you're feeling overwhelmed, where it's just something simple that you can come back to. And it's not going to be, the thing that helps you deal with like a hugely traumatic event or experience, but just when little things are starting to feel overwhelming, having a few strategies in your pocket that you can just call upon can really go a long way to help when things are feeling a bit overwhelming. So I'm going to show you this just short little video about what resilience is and how to cultivate more of it. And then we'll carry on with the next factor. I don't know if it's going to play from here. No, okay, I'm going to just switch my share again.
Have you ever heard people say, think positive, get your head in the game, have a healthy attitude? What does it even mean? To explain, let's take something we all know, like a phone. They're getting smarter, just like you. And as the adverts keep telling us, everything about them is connected. Which is true, everything is connected. Your physical, your mental, and your emotional health and well-being. All of them affecting each other and affecting you. Life's about finding balance. But how do we even do that? Well, the first bit's obvious. You've got to have charge. Sleep is essential for your body and brain to rest, regulate, and repair. About 9 hours to be properly charged up. Good morning. Next up, a phone is meant to be used for communication, sharing. Sharing and talking help staying connected. We're the same. Life's so much better when we're connected to our friends, family, and community. Your attitude will also improve when you learn and achieve new things. Set yourself a goal. Be faster, jump higher, expand your grasp of a new subject, or master the art of pancake flipping. There you go. You'll surprise yourself with what you can do and the feeling of reaching your goal, like the tastiest pancakes. When it comes to emotions, don't repress it, express it. Get creative and explore those feelings through art, music, whatever. If it all gets too much, remember to be present in the moment. Shut off the what-ifs and distractions. Take some time to just be. So when you put it all together, getting in charge, staying connected, setting goals, expressing yourself, and knowing when to take time out, you'll find that you're a lot more protected against the bumps and knocks of life. So you can carry on being awesome.
So I also recognize that the idea of getting 9 hours a night of sleep might feel incredibly overwhelming if you're not getting anywhere near that, but it's always just, we do our best. The thing I like about that video too is that I think that it really kind of ties in a lot of these different factors, like having a good support network and connections, and also expressing and experiencing all of your emotions, because sometimes the thing is emotions can feel really overwhelming, but often the more we kind of stuff them instead of acknowledging them and expressing them in a healthy way, then the more overwhelmed we can feel. And we're going to talk about that and how we can model that with kids, because of course kids can experience that same thing. If especially if they've grown up in a situation where they felt like they couldn't express themselves safely, or for other reasons, they're just sort of disconnected from how they feel. If we can teach them healthy ways to experience and express their emotions, then that's going to help them from just behaviors that are more like acting out those emotions because they don't know how to express them in any other way. And so we're going to talk about that specifically, but I kind of like that video because in talking about resilience, it kind of captures a lot of the different things that we're talking about, because really with all of these things, these protective factors are sort of building up your resilience as a family. And so then the next one is about social connections. And so for the reflection questions, I wanted to think about like, who are the people in your life who already support you? So that might be friends or family, or other people who you have around you. It might be your therapist or your counselor, or other supports that you're connected to in the community. And then I also thought that it's important sometimes to think about like, how do you feel when you support the people you love? Because for most of us, I think that we're really often quite comfortable supporting the people that we care about. But then if you contrast that to how does it feel reaching out for support, sometimes that's a little less easy to do. And sometimes we feel like we don't want to be a burden on people, or we don't want to look weak. But I think sometimes if you start by thinking about how would you feel if someone you really loved came to you and said like, hey, I'm really needing a little bit of extra help right now, you would probably jump on that opportunity and be happy to help them. So I think sometimes it's important to remember that the people who love us really do want to help us. And so not being afraid to reach out, and that strengthens your connections and allows everybody else to feel like they can ask for help when they need it too. And then thinking about how could you create stronger or more connections with people who already are in your life. And maybe it is sometimes just reaching out to say that you need something and offering that you'll be there to help them the next time they need it, or even just intentionally making more time to spend time together, just doing fun things. Especially as a parent, if you can make some time maybe to go and spend some social time with people in your life without your kids, and to kind of build your resilience in that way by having some time to do something that you like to do. Or there might be other ways that you can build connections that you already have, or make new ones. And then when we're talking about concrete supports for families, I also wanted to point out that like self-care and individual resilience is not a solution for social inequities and other systemic level problems. Because sometimes when I was looking at videos about resilience, a lot of them talked about like getting used to, or like sort of accommodating yourself to situations that seem difficult. And I think that there is an element of that, but also I don't think that people should accommodate themselves to situations that are inequitable. And so these are times when it is important to reach out for supports that you might not be getting. And also, yeah, just to recognize that like, you know, people shouldn't be accommodating themselves to situations like abuse or different things like that. And so I just want to point out that I think that sometimes we focus a lot on self-care, and self-care is really important. And also we need a lot more than that for some situations that we're facing. And I think it's also really important to remember that every family needs help sometimes, like no matter what your circumstances are. Again, we can often have a bit of a resistance to wanting to ask for help, but everybody needs help at one time or another. And there are supports in community available, and that's exactly what they're for. And so we might as well utilize them. And then thinking about what supports do you need from community that you aren't currently getting. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of resources now. It's going to be like 4 slides worth. So just to let you know that it's going to feel like a lot, but it's not endless. And you'll also have all of these in your workbook, so you don't feel like you need to like jot everything down. But just to show you, like there are lots of supports available. And so thinking about what are some that might be useful for you in your situation to connect with. So we're going to start with a bunch of different support lines. So these are all like 24/7 crisis lines. Some of them are more specific. So like some of them are specific for Indigenous mental health supports, residential school survivors and their families. Of course, the KSACC one is specific to sexual violence or family violence. The suicide hotline is for anyone who is dealing with thoughts of suicide or supporting someone who you're worried might be thinking about suicide. And then the kids help phone and the interior crisis hotline are just more general. So kind of any sort of crisis situation that you or a youth might be dealing with, you can call those hotlines. And so I want to say too, like as a volunteer at KSACC's crisis hotline before I started working with them, if you've never called a 24-hour crisis line and you feel like you could use the support, like just call them, because it's what they're there for. And there's somebody always waiting to answer that call and to give you some advice or some support or some resources, whatever it is you need. And I think sometimes it can feel a little bit intimidating. I don't know, it might just be a generational thing that I don't really like talking on the phone, but it is really nice to know that these support lines exist and are available to you. And of course, they're all no cost. It's confidential and anonymous. And so sometimes this is a good place to reach out if you just need somebody to chat to with whatever you're dealing with. Next, we've got a bunch of stuff for housing, family, and childcare. So SCFS and LMO, of course, are working with First Nations and Métis families, doing a bunch of different programs and services. The Boys and Girls Club has programs for youth, like drop-in groups. Some of these things, I'm not exactly sure what they're providing during COVID, but you can always just get on their website or give them a call and see what they've got available. Elizabeth Fry has their free legal clinic, and then they also have housing resources, including the rent bank, which is like interest-free loans for people who can't make their rent. And then they've got different youth and employment and community programs. Childcare Resource and Referral Center connects people with childcare providers and also helps with childcare subsidies and grants. And Interior Community Services has a whole bunch of programs for families and parents. And they also have a safe spaces program for queer youth in the community as well. Then for counseling and support, again, some of these are really specific. Access First Steps, for example, is substance use oriented programming, is Indian Residential School Survivors Society supports, obviously, residential school survivors and their families. At KSACC, we assist people who have any experiences of sexual abuse or sexual assault or family violence. And then the Y and the Children's Therapy and Family Resource Center are kind of more general. Family Tree is a lot of trauma and addiction stuff, and also a lot of pregnancy care stuff. And again, all of these are free services. And so, of course, with that, some of them might have wait lists, but a lot of them are going to have groups and different kinds of programs that people can access if they are waiting for one-on-one supports. And then lastly, just general health and wellness supports. And so Ask Wellness Society has all kinds of stuff for health and housing and employment. First Nations Health Authority is going to have all kinds of health services, including dental, pharmacy, and vision care. BC 211 is just a sort of umbrella referral resource for any kind of health related issues. And so you can just phone or text just the numbers 211 and or get on their website and you can be connected to, I think they also have crisis and support lines, but they can give you referrals or help with any health related stuff. The Friendship Society does childhood development stuff, family and youth services, and then also has health and mental health services. Community Living BC is for people living with developmental disability, autism, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And they work with, I know they work with adults, and I believe that they work with youth as well. And then CMHA is all manner of mental health supports. So a whole bunch of resources that are available in community that hopefully now you'll have these on hand and will be able to reach out if you ever need supports from any of these organizations doing great work. And then the sixth protective factor is social and emotional competence. And basically what this means is just equipping kids for how to respond in appropriate ways in social situations, and also in dealing with their own emotions. And so for self-reflection, thinking about like, what are the social and emotional skills that are important to your family? So maybe some of the social values that your family holds are showing respect to other people, or being a good host when you have guests in your home, or speaking up when you have something on your mind that you think is important, things like that. Or emotionally thinking about like expressing your emotions in a healthy and positive way. And then the next one, not really a question, but just to sort of tying back into that idea of how understanding and being able to express how a person is feeling and understanding your emotions, rather than getting overwhelmed by them and acting out because you're not really sure what else to do with this big feeling you have. If you can name and understand what that feeling is, then that's going to help to be able to regulate emotions. And that goes for kids and adults alike, because I think even a lot of adults, just for a lot of us, the way that we were raised was you had a limited amount of emotions that you were allowed to express, which I think is just kind of a cultural thing for a lot of us. And so then often we don't know what to do if we feel really sad or really angry, or really like we have experienced an injustice and we don't know what to do with it. So I think the better we can get about that for ourselves, the better we can model that for our kids. And so then that sort of leads us into the next point, is how can you model those social and emotional competencies to the kids in your life, and even the other people in your life. Sometimes seeing people do that well, again, I think sometimes we're hesitant to name our emotions because we don't want to appear weak or different things like that. But sometimes it can be very freeing and inspiring to see someone who has good emotional competence and can just be in their emotions and do it well. And then thinking about what are ways that you can improve your own social and emotional skills. What aspects of social competency or emotional competency would you like to improve in yourself, and how might you think about doing that? Because again, the more you can do it. I heard a quote recently about raising kids, and it was something like, don't worry that your kids aren't listening to what you say, worry that they are seeing everything you do, or something like that. So it's basically this idea that it's like you can tell kids things all day long, but really it comes down to how you're acting and what you're modeling to them. And so then thinking about how we can teach some of those skills. So we can create an environment in which children feel safe to express their emotions. And we're going to talk about this more in the future presentations too, like when we're talking about boundaries and consent, and talking about how those all tie into, like, you can't really have a good sense of your own boundaries and what's acceptable to you or not if you aren't really in touch with sort of how you're feeling from moment to moment. And also like allowing kids to feel safe being who they are and expressing who they are and feeling what they feel is going to help later on down the road when you might need them to have the sort of relationship with you where they can come to you if something goes wrong. Like we're going to talk about that, especially we're going to talk about online safety later. And it's like, we want to have a relationship where if something goes wrong, a kid can feel comfortable coming to you and telling you about it. And so that can start early by not shaming them for the way that they feel or the things that they do, which sometimes might look like not the best decision, but understanding and helping them understand maybe why they did it. and why they're feeling the way they feel, and lay that foundation. And so being emotionally responsive to children and modeling empathy kind of goes along with that too. It's like responding to them in an appropriate way to what they're feeling. Separating emotions from actions. So again, like when we're saying that we want to allow kids to express and feel all of their emotions, we also obviously need to set boundaries. Like it's okay to be angry, but we're not going to hit someone because we're angry. So giving them outlets where they might want to, like if you have a kid who is really sort of physically expressive with their anger, maybe you get them a really punchable pillow, or, you can teach them how to like scream in the bathtub, that kind of thing. Just so that because the thing about emotions too is they live in our bodies. And so especially for kids, they're so embodied that sometimes they really just need to like move that emotion through them. So giving them healthy ways to do that is really important. Again, naming feelings is just kind of a foundational one that sometimes we don't think about, but just talking about when feelings are coming up for you, or when you recognize it in them, not telling them how they feel, but saying, oh, like if you have a stomach ache and you're sort of feeling a little bit like not well, like maybe you're nervous about something, and trying to help them figure out maybe what some of those body cues are. And also this can be helpful, like, you can use like TV and movies to talk about some of these things too. I don't know if any of you have seen Pixar's Inside Out, but it's like all about how all of our feelings have different roles in our life. And it's a really good one for talking about the importance of the full range of emotions. Encouraging and reinforcing social skills like greeting others and taking turns. So that's more sort of on that social competency. Talking about and celebrating differences, and understanding that social competencies, or like different ways of interacting, are going to look different for different people. And then again, sort of going back to the knowledge of parenting point, knowing which skills are age appropriate so that you don't get frustrated if you would like your kid to be developing certain social competencies and they don't seem to be getting it. Sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it really is just a developmental stage thing where they're going to come to that a little bit later. So then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and again, this is a page in the workbook, is just really thinking about, so this was a lot of information, which could definitely feel really overwhelming, or, you might think like, oh, that's all really great ideas. And then you kind of just get busy doing your thing because life is always crazy. And so really thinking about ways that you can implement some of these things. So even if it's just, I'm going to get on that CDC website and read like the page for the age that my kids are, and see if there's any new information in there for me. Or I'm going to learn a breathing technique so that I can have something to sort of shore up my resilience when I'm having an overwhelming day. So maybe just picking one thing that you can implement this week or even this month, and just seeing how that feels. And maybe it's a strategy that you think like, oh, that didn't really do much. So then picking something else and implementing that and seeing if that helps. And then a little bit longer term, like what's maybe one strategy you could implement this year? Is there a way that you could build some of these things into your routine, and just see if that can be helpful for any of the issues that you might be going through as a family, or even just preventative, or things that might be helpful for you to generally help with resilience and feeling like you're better equipped to just sort of face the everyday challenges of parenting and living through a pandemic and all of the things. And then also just thinking about and maybe jotting down in the workbook, where's a place that you can reach out for help if you need it. So maybe that's a name of somebody that someone in your life who is going to be there for you. Maybe you haven't reached out for them in a while. It might be nice to connect. Or maybe it's one of the resources that we talked about. Maybe it's one of the crisis lines, or maybe it's somebody who can help you out with something that you're dealing with that's a little bit bigger picture, whether it's counseling or housing or anything like that. And so just so that you have a little tiny action plan to move forward, so that you feel like you can start implementing some of these things. And if you're watching this on the recording, hopefully the workbook will be linked where the video is, so you can still have access to that as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to say too, like I mentioned before, parenting is really difficult. We don't always have a lot of direct education about how to do it. And I think that it's often easy to feel like we're not doing enough or we're not getting it right. And really, like, there is no such thing as perfect parenting, and everyone is just doing the best that they can. So do always remember to come back to that too, and be kind to yourself, and to just recognize that you're going to be the best parent that you can be at any given time. And also even just the fact that you are watching a webinar like this and trying to understand how trauma might be impacting your kids is already a huge step in wanting to be proactive in doing things better. And so give yourself credit for that. So that is the end of the presentation portion. So I am going to stop the recording and stop the screen share, and then we can get into some Q&A stuff.